"Sir, if you can't pay tonight, you need to take your daughter somewhere else." The words landed harder than the cold rain still dripping from Ethan Miller's jacket, not because they were loud, but because Lily heard them too. She was 8 years old, curled against his chest in a pink hoodie gone damp at the shoulders, her tiny fingers fisted in the fabric of his shirt, her breathing thin and uneven like a song trying not to end. Mercy Ridge Medical Center glowed bright behind the sliding glass doors, all polished tile and fluorescent light, all warmth for the people who could afford to belong there. Ethan stood in the middle of that emergency room lobby with mud on his boots, $43 in his wallet, and the one thing a father should never have to carry in his arms, his child's fear. "Please," he said, and his voice was steady in the way voices get when panic has gone too deep to shake. "She has a heart condition. She can't catch her breath." The receptionist barely looked up from the screen. "Do you have active insurance?" "It lapsed last month." "Then I need a payment method before we can admit her." Ethan stared at her as if the sentence itself had to be wrong. Behind him, the storm tapped at the glass in restless bursts. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. A coffee machine hissed. A man in a business suit coughed into his fist and looked away. Life kept moving, because tragedy always feels quieter when it belongs to someone else. Lily shifted in his arms and pressed her cheek against his shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, ashamed of a pain she had no business apologizing for. "I'm trying." Ethan swallowed hard enough to hurt. He lowered his forehead to hers and brushed the damp hair back from her temple. "I know you are, sweetheart," he murmured. "Just stay with me. Nice and slow. Breathe with Daddy." He inhaled deeply, exaggerating the motion, and she tried to follow, but the breath caught halfway in her chest. Her small body trembled. Her lips had lost too much color. That was when the doctor at the triage desk finally looked over. Dr. Conrad Hayes, immaculate white coat, silver watch, expression sharpened by long practice and little mercy. His eyes traveled from Ethan's soaked jeans to Lily's worn sneakers, then back to the expired insurance form in Ethan's hand. "Mr. Miller," he said, with the clipped patience of someone speaking to a problem instead of a person, "this is an emergency department, not a free clinic." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Men like him had learned what anger cost in rooms run by people with power. He just held his daughter closer, as if the force of his arms alone might keep her anchored here. "She's a little girl," he said quietly. "She needs help." Hayes opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Lily's sleeve slipped down from her wrist, and the old silver bracelet caught the fluorescent light. A nurse walking past slowed for one heartbeat, then stopped completely. Her face changed, and in that single breath of silence, everything in the room began to turn. Grace Whitaker had spent 9 years inside hospitals, and she had learned that the most dangerous thing in a building full of medicine was not disease. It was indifference practiced long enough to sound reasonable. She turned back toward the front desk, her sneakers whispering across the tile, eyes fixed on the silver bracelet hanging loose around the little girl's wrist. It was old-fashioned, the kind hospitals used to issue by hand before everything became barcodes and plastic tags. The metal was worn soft at the edges, but the engraving was still there. Clara Miller, Mercy Ridge, 2016. Grace felt the breath leave her chest so suddenly she had to steady herself on the counter. "Where did she get that bracelet?" she asked, and for the first time since Ethan had walked in, someone in the room sounded like they were talking about Lily instead of around her. Ethan looked up, rainwater still dripping from his hair onto the shoulders of his jacket. His face had that exhausted look grief leaves behind, the kind that never fully goes away, only changes shape. "It was her mother's," he said. "Why?" Grace did not answer right away. She crouched in front of Lily instead, her expression softening as she gently touched 2 fingers to the girl's wrist. Lily's skin was cool. Her pulse was fast, too fast. "Hey there, sweetheart," Grace said quietly. "Can you tell me your name?" "Lily," she whispered. "Lily Miller." Grace nodded, but her eyes had gone glassy with memory. She had heard that name before. Not Lily. Clara. For years, her mother had spoken it almost like a prayer, always on the anniversary of the bus crash on Route 19, always with tears in her eyes. Clara Miller, the emergency responder who climbed into twisted metal and smoke 3 times to pull strangers out, even after she had every reason to stop. Clara Miller, who stayed awake in the ambulance long enough to squeeze Margaret Whitaker's hand and tell her she was going to live. Clara Miller, who never made it home. Grace rose slowly and looked at Ethan with a kind of stunned recognition that made him shift his weight. "Your wife was Clara Miller?" she asked. Ethan's arms tightened around Lily. For a moment, the noise of the emergency room seemed to fall back. "Yes," he said carefully. "She died 6 years ago." Grace swallowed. "My mother knew her name. My mother is alive because of her." The receptionist blinked, suddenly uncertain. Dr. Hayes looked irritated, as if sentiment had interrupted procedure. "Nurse Whitaker," he said sharply, "this is not relevant to Triage." Grace stood up straighter. "A child in respiratory distress is relevant to Triage." Hayes folded his arms. "And protocol is still protocol. No insurance. No admission without approval." Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second, just one, like a man trying to hold the walls up inside himself. Then Lily gave a small, broken cough against his shoulder, and that was enough. Grace stepped closer, her voice low and firm. "Put her on bed 3. Now." The words hit the room like a dropped tray. Grace did not raise her voice, but something in it cut clean through the hum of fluorescent lights and printer noise and the restless shuffle of people waiting to be seen. The receptionist froze with one hand still hovering over the keyboard. Ethan looked up as if he had not heard right, because hope had become a language too expensive to trust. Dr. Conrad Hayes, however, heard her perfectly. His jaw tightened. "Bed 3 is occupied," he said, "and this case has not been cleared." Grace turned to face him fully now, one hand already supporting Lily's shoulders as Ethan carefully lowered her onto the nearest transport chair. "Bed 3 is occupied by a teenager with a sprained wrist waiting on an X-ray," Grace replied. "This child is struggling to breathe." Hayes stepped forward, voice smooth in that practiced way some people use when they want cruelty to sound professional. "Nurse Whitaker, if you cannot separate personal sentiment from policy, I will find someone who can." Ethan's shoulders stiffened, but he said nothing. He was kneeling beside Lily now, brushing the hair from her forehead, his large calloused hand almost covering her tiny one. "Look at me, Lil," he whispered. "Just me. In through your nose. Slow as you can." Lily tried. Her chest rose too fast, then stalled, then fluttered again. Her eyes searched his face with that terrible little girl bravery children use when they know the grown-up they love is scared and want to help anyway. "Daddy," she breathed. "Am I making trouble?" Ethan's face changed in a way that made Grace have to look down for 1 second. "No, sweetheart," he said, voice rough with restraint. "You are never trouble. Not to me. Not for 1 second." Grace reached for the portable pulse oximeter clipped to the wall and slid it onto Lily's finger. The numbers blinked, climbed, then dipped lower than she liked. Much lower. She did not need a doctor's order to recognize danger. She looked at Hayes. "Her oxygen is dropping." He glanced at the monitor, then at the admissions screen, as if the billing code still mattered more. "Get respiratory if you want," he said, "but no room assignment until finance clears it." Grace stared at him, and something old and fierce moved behind her eyes. She had spent years learning when to obey and when to answer to something higher than a handbook. "Clara Miller climbed into a wrecked bus 3 times to save my mother," she said quietly. "Tonight, I am not going to stand here and let Clara Miller's daughter be denied a bed because a computer says her father is poor." A hush fell over the desk. Even the man in the business suit stopped, pretending not to listen. Ethan looked up then, really looked at Grace, confusion and exhaustion giving way to something softer, almost disoriented. He was not used to being defended. Grace turned back to the hallway and called out, "I need a respiratory card in triage now." A young orderly hesitated only half a second before moving. Hayes took 1 step toward her. "If you do this without authorization, you are putting your job at risk." Grace did not flinch. She reached for the transport chair handles and started rolling Lily toward bed 3. "Then I will lose it doing the one thing this place was built for," she said. "Keeping a child alive." Bed 3 sat behind a half-drawn curtain near the end of triage, tucked beneath a fluorescent panel that buzzed faintly like a trapped insect. It was not much of a room, barely more than a narrow space with a monitor, an oxygen port, and a rolling stool with 1 crooked wheel, but to Ethan it looked like sanctuary. Grace guided Lily onto the bed with practiced hands, lifting the little girl's shoulders while Ethan eased off her wet hoodie and laid it over the chair beside him. Lily looked smaller under the hospital blanket, her cheeks pale against the white pillow, lashes fluttering each time she fought for a full breath. The pulse oximeter kept blinking numbers Ethan did not understand, but did not trust. He stood close enough to touch her every second, as if distance itself had become dangerous. "I need a non-rebreather mask and a pediatric respiratory setup," Grace called, already clipping leads onto Lily's chest. "And page Dr. Patel in cardiology if she is still in the building." The orderly nodded and disappeared. Hayes entered a moment later with the controlled stride of a man who believed authority should never have to hurry. "I am documenting this," he said. "You have overridden intake, triage assignment, and billing clearance." Grace did not look at him. She was checking Lily's hands now, rubbing warmth into fingers gone too cold. "Document whatever helps you sleep tonight." Ethan looked between them, lost in the strange battlefield of adult power, while his daughter's breathing remained the only thing that mattered. "What is happening?" he asked, voice low, careful, as though too much fear might frighten Lily. Grace finally turned to him, and in her face he saw something he had not expected to find in this building tonight: honesty. "I think she is headed into a cardiac episode triggered by low oxygen and stress," she said. "I am trying to stabilize her before it gets worse." Ethan nodded once, but his hand gripped the bed rail hard enough for his knuckles to pale. "She has tetralogy of Fallot," he said. "She had surgery when she was 3, but the doctor told us there could still be complications if she got sick or overtired. She was fine this morning. She just got tired after school, then dizzy after dinner, and by the time I got her into the truck, she could barely talk." Grace paused. "You drove here in that storm?" Ethan gave a tired half-shrug that did not quite qualify as an answer. 27 miles. Grace glanced at the soaked hem of his jeans, the trembling in his hands he kept trying to hide, the way his wedding ring still sat on his finger though it had been 6 years. She had seen devotion before. She had not seen much of it tonight. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Ethan looked at Lily instead of her. "I almost came sooner," he admitted. "But I knew the insurance was gone. I kept thinking maybe if I waited an hour, maybe if I could get her fever down, maybe if I did not walk in here looking broke and desperate." His voice failed him there. Lily opened her eyes a sliver and found him through the blur. "Daddy," she whispered through the mask Grace had just settled over her face. "Did I lose my bracelet?" Ethan bent instantly, brushing his thumb over the silver band on her wrist. "No, baby. I have got it right here." Grace's eyes dropped to the bracelet again, and this time she noticed something she had missed before. Along the inside edge, beneath years of scratches and wear, another line had been engraved in letters so tiny they were almost hidden. Grace leaned closer, her breath catching as she read the words Clara had left behind, and the room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "For the child I may never meet." Grace read the tiny engraving twice, because the first time did not feel possible. "For the child I may never meet." The words were so intimate, so heartbreakingly small, that for a second the hospital room around her blurred into nothing but the sound of oxygen moving through Lily's mask and the steady rain tapping the high windows down the hall. She looked up at Ethan, who was still bent over his daughter, one hand wrapped around the bed rail, the other smoothing Lily's hair in the same motion again and again, as if rhythm itself might keep her anchored. "Ethan," Grace said quietly, "did Clara have this made before Lily was born?" He looked at the bracelet, and something in his face softened with old grief. "A few weeks before," he said. "She found out we were having a girl after a long shift and drove straight to a jeweler in town. Said she wanted Lily to have something from her mother even if life got complicated." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Back then we thought complicated meant daycare costs and sleep deprivation." Grace swallowed. She knew. Ethan nodded once. Clara was 3 months pregnant when the Route 19 crash happened. The room fell still in a different way now, not with tension, but with the weight of a truth that had been waiting years to be heard aloud. Grace stepped back as if the air had changed temperature. Her mother had told the story dozens of times, always through tears, always with reverence. Clara Miller climbing through broken seats and shattered glass, Clara talking to strangers like they were family, Clara refusing to stop even after the smoke got too thick and the paramedics outside begged her to let the fire crew take over. But no one had ever told Grace that Clara had been carrying a child at the time. No one had ever said the woman who saved her mother had also been protecting a life no one could see. She never got to hold her, Ethan said, eyes fixed on Lily. Clara died 2 days later. Internal injuries. They got Lily out safely, but he stopped there because some sentences do not become easier with practice. Lily shifted under the blanket, the oxygen mask fogging softly with each breath, and Ethan reached for her hand again as if that unfinished thought belonged nowhere near her. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth for 1 second, steadying herself, then turned and walked straight past Hayes, who had been standing in the doorway with folded arms and growing irritation. "Call Margaret Whitaker," she said. Hayes frowned. "Excuse me." Grace faced him fully. "Call my mother. This is not a family matter. It became one 6 years ago." Hayes exhaled sharply. "Nurse Whitaker, I am not dragging in a board donor because you have attached yourself emotionally to a patient." Grace's eyes flashed, but her voice stayed level. "Then let me be very clear. The little girl in that bed is the daughter of the woman who saved my mother's life. My mother funds half the cardiac outreach program in this hospital, and if Lily Miller stops breathing while we argue about billing policy, the least of your problems will be me." Hayes stared at her, perhaps waiting for the usual retreat, the second-guessing, the fear. It never came. At the bedside, Ethan said nothing, but he heard every word. He had spent so many years carrying Clara's absence like a private wound that hearing her name spoken with honor by someone outside his own home felt almost disorienting. Grace turned to the phone on the wall, already reaching for it herself. And that was when the heart monitor gave a sharp warning chirp, one sudden sound that made every person in the room look at Lily at once. The chirp from the monitor lasted less than a second, but it changed the temperature in the room. Grace was at Lily's bedside before the second alert sounded, eyes moving from the pulse oximeter to the little girl's face and back again. Lily's lashes fluttered. Her small chest still rose beneath the blanket, but the rhythm had turned shallow and uneven, like a candle flame fighting a draft. "Lily, stay with me, sweetheart," Grace said, adjusting the oxygen mask and checking the line behind her ears. Ethan stepped closer so fast the rolling stool scraped against the tile. "What is it?" he asked, and there it was at last, the fear he had been trying to bury under calm and manners and endurance. Grace did not lie to him. Her oxygen just dipped again. "I need to move faster." She hit the call button with the side of her hand and reached for the blood pressure cuff. Hayes finally entered the room instead of hovering in the doorway, but there was irritation in his posture, not urgency. "This is exactly why I said cardiology should assess before you started making decisions," he said. Grace shot him a look sharp enough to stop Lesserman. "And if I had waited for finance, she would still be in the lobby." The cuff tightened around Lily's thin arm. Ethan stood frozen for one terrible moment, then forced himself to move where Grace pointed. "I need you by her left side," she said. "Talk to her. Keep her focused on your voice." Ethan nodded immediately. He took Lily's hand in both of his and leaned close enough that his forehead almost touched the blanket. "Hey, Bug," he whispered, using the nickname so gently it sounded like a prayer. "You remember what we do when things get scary?" Lily's eyes opened a sliver. "We count," she murmured behind the mask. "That is right," Ethan said, and his voice steadied as if fatherhood itself had become a rope he could hold. "We count and breathe. Just you and me. 1, 2, 3. Grace listened while she worked. "Count, check, adjust. Count, listen, breathe." The room filled with those small, necessary sounds. The hiss of oxygen, the soft rubber snap of gloves, the rain against the distant windows. The pulse monitor warning them that time was not interested in anyone's pride. A respiratory therapist hurried in with a card, followed by a pediatric resident Grace recognized from the 4th floor. "Thank God," Grace said, not because she had run out of skill, but because no one should have to carry a child's life alone. "She has a congenital heart history and she is desatting under stress. I need respiratory support and a stat page to Dr. Patel." The resident glanced at Hayes, uncertain. Hayes opened his mouth, but Ethan spoke first, not loudly, just clearly. "Please stop talking about her like she is paperwork." Every person in the room went still. Ethan did not look angry. He looked tired in the oldest way a man can look tired, as if life had taken from him in measured pieces. And he had simply kept showing up anyway. He squeezed Lily's hand and kept his eyes on her. "My daughter is scared," he said. She is trying very hard to be brave. If anyone here still remembers why hospitals exist, help her. Grace saw something flicker across the resident's face then, some buried part of compassion waking up under fluorescent light. The therapist stepped in without waiting for permission. Hayes said nothing. And while the adults around her finally began acting like Lily's life mattered, the little girl lifted one trembling hand to the silver bracelet on her wrist, as if even now some part of her knew her mother was not done protecting her. The room did not become calm, but it became focused, and sometimes that is the closest thing to mercy. The respiratory therapist, a broad-shouldered man named Kevin with silver at his temples and the kind of steady voice children trusted, adjusted Lily's mask and switched her to a higher flow of oxygen. The pediatric resident, Dr. Naomi Patel's first-year fellow, listened to Grace's report, checked Lily's chart, and finally stopped looking to Hayes for permission. Ethan stayed where Grace had placed him, left side of the bed, one hand around Lily's fingers, the other resting lightly over her blanket, as if he could lend her some of his own strength by touch alone. "You are doing so good, Bug," he murmured. "I need 10 slow breaths from you. Can you give me 10? Lily nodded faintly and tried. 1 breath. 2. A pause. Then another. The monitor still chirped now and then, but the sharp panic in the sound had softened. Grace watched the oxygen number inch upward 1 point at a time and let herself take 1 full breath for the first time in minutes. Hayes, however, stood near the foot of the bed with his arms folded, his face set in that hard professional blankness people wear when they suspect the room is turning against them. "If this turns into a full admission, someone is going to have to explain why protocol was bypassed," he said. No one answered him. It was not defiance so much as exhaustion. There are only so many times people can hear the word protocol before they realize it is being used as a synonym. For permission not to care, Grace reached for the wall phone anyway and dialed her mother's private number from memory. It rang twice. "Grace." Margaret Whitaker answered, her voice warm and surprised, and still carrying the faint elegance of a woman who had once spent years speaking at charity galas and hospital boards. "Honey, it is after 10. Is everything all right?" Grace turned slightly away from the bed, but her eyes never left Lily. "Mom, I need you to come to Mercy Ridge right now." There was a pause on the line. "Grace, what happened?" Grace looked at the silver bracelet on Lily's wrist, then at Ethan's face, worn thin by rain and fear and 6 years of raising a child without the woman he still loved. "I found Clara Miller's daughter," she said softly. On the other end of the line, silence. Then a sound Grace had not heard from her mother in years, a small broken inhale, as if the past had reached through the phone and laid a hand over her heart. "That is not possible," Margaret whispered. "Clara died. She was pregnant, Mom. Ethan is here. Their little girl is in distress, and this hospital almost turned them away." Another silence, this one colder. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had changed. The softness was still there, but underneath it was steel. "I am leaving now." The line clicked dead. Grace lowered the phone just as the curtain rustled, and an older woman in a pale blue volunteer smock appeared at the doorway with a folded blanket in her arms. She had been one of the women waiting in the lobby, quiet and unnoticed, but her eyes were wet now as she looked at Lily. "I heard the name Miller," she said carefully. "Are you Ethan Miller from Oak Hollow?" Ethan looked up, confused. "Yes." The woman pressed the blanket to her chest. "Your wife used to bring canned food to St. Andrew's Pantry every Thanksgiving. She left little notes in the boxes for the children." Ethan stared at her as if he had stepped into someone else's memory. The woman smiled through tears. "One of those notes got my grandson through the first Christmas after his father left." Then she laid the blanket gently across the foot of Lily's bed and whispered, "Your Clara is still taking care of people, honey." The words of the volunteer settled over Ethan like warm hands on cold skin, and for a moment he could not answer. He only looked down at Lily, at the tiny rise and fall of her chest beneath the blanket, at the silver bracelet glinting under hospital light, and wondered how many pieces of Clara were still moving through the world without him knowing. Grace thanked the woman softly and promised to return the blanket before the night was over, but the woman only shook her head. "Keep it on the little one," she said. "Looks like she needs every bit of kindness she can get." Then she slipped back into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt gentler than the ones before. Lily's breathing had steadied some under the oxygen, enough that the pulse monitor no longer sounded like a warning every few seconds. Dr. Patel's fellow listened to her chest again, murmured something to Kevin about fluid movement and possible strain, then looked at Grace with the first hint of cautious optimism. "She is responding," he said. "Not out of danger, but better than 10 minutes ago." Ethan bowed his head for one brief second, not in victory, just gratitude, too tired to stand upright. He pressed Lily's hand to his lips and whispered, "That is my brave girl." Lily's eyes fluttered open. "Daddy?" she said through the mask, voice faint and fuzzy. "Yes, Bug. I am right here." She looked past him toward Grace, then back again. "Did I do okay?" Ethan smiled in a way that almost broke Grace's heart. "You did perfect." Grace was about to adjust Lily's blanket when the sound of quick footsteps cut through the hallway outside. Not hurried in the frantic sense, but purposeful, the kind of steps that do not ask permission to enter a room. Hayes straightened instinctively. The curtain drew back, and Margaret Whittaker came in wearing a camel-colored coat over a silk blouse, silver hair pinned neatly despite the rain still shining on her shoulders. She was in her early 60s now, graceful and upright, but there was nothing fragile about the way she took in the room. Her gaze landed first on Grace, then on Lily, then on Ethan, and then she saw the bracelet. Margaret stopped so abruptly that Grace moved toward her in case she lost her balance. She did not. She simply raised one trembling hand to her mouth and stared at the engraving as tears filled her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan stood, unsure whether to offer his hand or his name or an explanation for a history he had not known she carried. Margaret looked at him as though she had found a face from a dream she had been trying to return to for years. "You are Ethan," she said. "Clara's husband." He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took his hand in both of hers. "Your wife saved my life." Her voice shook, but only with feeling, not weakness. "I looked for you after the funeral, but someone told me you moved away after the baby was born. I never got the chance to thank you. I never got the chance to tell you what she meant to me." Ethan glanced at Lily, then back at Margaret, and there was something almost helpless in his expression now, as if kindness after this much humiliation felt harder to hold than pain. "She would have wanted the child treated," he said quietly. Margaret's face changed. She turned, slowly and completely, toward Dr. Hayes. The room went still. Even the fluorescent buzz seemed to lower itself. "Is it true," Margaret asked, every word calm and precise, "that this hospital tried to turn away the daughter of the woman who died saving me because her father could not pay at the front desk?" No one answered Margaret Whittaker right away, and somehow that silence said more than any excuse could have. Dr. Hayes adjusted the cuff of his white coat, buying himself a second he had not earned, then another. "There was confusion during intake," he said at last, choosing each word with the care of a man who had just realized the room was no longer under his control. "The patient arrived without active insurance, and standard admissions procedures were still being evaluated when Nurse Whittaker made a unilateral decision to place her in treatment." Margaret did not blink. "That was not my question." Her voice never rose, but the air in the room tightened all the same. Grace stood near the monitor with one hand resting lightly on Lily's blanket, while Ethan remained at his daughter's side, shoulders still damp from rain, one palm wrapped around her tiny fingers as if he had no intention of ever letting go again. Hayes tried once more. "Mrs. Whittaker, Mercy Ridge serves hundreds of patients a week. Protocol exists for a reason. We cannot simply bypass protocol," Margaret repeated, and now there was sorrow in her voice, which somehow landed harder than anger. "Clara Miller did not ask for protocol when she climbed back into that wreck to save me. She did not ask if my insurance was current. She did not ask if I was worth the cost. She saw a human life, doctor. Tonight, all you saw was an expired policy." The words settled over the room like a verdict. Hayes looked away first. The young resident lowered his eyes. Even Kevin, who had likely seen every kind of hospital politics in 20 years, stood very still beside the oxygen cart. Margaret turned toward Ethan again, and when she spoke, her tone softened into something almost maternal. "I am sorry," she said. "Not in the polished way institutions apologize after they are caught. I mean, I am truly sorry that you had to beg in the same building where your wife once gave more than anyone had a right to ask of her." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. and Grace could almost see the struggle behind his eyes. Humiliation had a way of making kindness hard to receive. But when he finally spoke, his voice held no bitterness, only exhaustion and a quiet dignity that made every person in that room feel smaller and wiser at the same time. "I did not bring my daughter here for revenge," he said. "I brought her here because she could not breathe." He looked down at Lily, whose color had finally begun to return, faint but visible, like dawn after a brutal night. "If you want to do something for me, do not make the next father explain why his child deserves help." Grace had to look away for a second after that, because some truths arrive so gently they leave no defense against them. Margaret nodded once, slowly, as if receiving an instruction she intended to honor for the rest of her life. "Then that is what we will do." She turned to Hayes. "Effective tonight, every pediatric emergency admission at Mercy Ridge will be treated first and billed later under the Clara Miller Fund. I will endow it myself if I have to. And before sunrise, I want the full security footage from the front desk, the intake records, and a written account of every person who delayed this child's care." Hayes opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Across the bed, Lily stirred and looked up through heavy eyelids. "Daddy," she whispered. Ethan bent immediately, his face softening into something Grace suspected Clara would have recognized from a mile away. "I am here, Bug." Lily's fingers tightened weakly around his. "Can we go home when the rain stops?" Ethan smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached his eyes. "Yeah," he said, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "When the rain stops." Margaret stepped back, giving them space, and Grace adjusted the blanket the volunteer had left behind. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder farther away now, the rain softening against the windows to a patient hush. Inside bed 3, under fluorescent light and borrowed grace, a little girl breathed easier, a father stood taller, and an entire hospital learned that sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one with the title or the money or the power to deny. Sometimes it is the man who walks in soaked to the bone, carrying his child with both arms and his dignity with the little strength he has left, and still asks the world to be kinder than it has been to him.